Hi, everyone. Acts of God today, and our summary of Acts chapter 8, verse 26 to 40. Uh, the question that we were dealing with this week was how can I be ready to be used by God to share the gospel? We know that salvation is God's work. In fact, we began with a Billy Graham quote that said that salvation is an act of God. It is initiated by God, wrought by God, and sustained by God. God is the only one who can save, and yet God used Billy Graham to present the gospel to probably 2 billion people, and there were 210 million people who responded to the invitation to come to Jesus that was presented by Billy. You and I aren't Billy Graham, but God calls us to be ready to share the gospel. We see that in Acts chapter 8, 26 to 40. We've already met Philip in Acts chapter 6. Philip was someone who was filled with the Spirit of God and wisdom. And we said that was the first thing that we need to be or to have in order to be ready to be used by God to share the gospel. We need to be people of character who know Jesus and whose lives are being touched in an ongoing way by Jesus. For Philip, that meant that he was willing to obey God and listen to God's voice. And so an angel speaks to him and says, leave the city and the glamour and go to the lonely and deserted place on the desert road. And so Philip does that. Once he gets there, there is an Ethiopian, and the Spirit of God impresses on Philip that he needs to go and stand next to the chariot. And so God's Spirit speaks to Philip and says, go stand by the chariot. And he hears the person in the chariot reading from the prophet Isaiah. And he's reading this passage. He was led like a sheep to the slaughter, and as a lamb before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. And Philip the Ethiopian had a question for Philip: is this prophet speaking about himself or someone else? And we're told in verse 35 that Philip began with that very passage of Scripture and told him the good news about Jesus. Not only was Philip filled with the Spirit, not only do we need to be filled with the Spirit of God if we're going to be ready to be used by God, but we need to be willing and ready to share the good news about Jesus. There's no better place in Scripture to start than Isaiah 53, where God speaks of the coming of his Messiah and servant who would suffer and would die on behalf of his people. And so Philip shares that message boldly and confidently with the Ethiopian. And there's a response to the good news about Jesus. The response is a response of faith and obedience. In verse 36, we're told they traveled along and they came to some water, and the eunuch said, look, here is water. What can stand in the way of my being baptized? And so we said that Philip encouraged a discipleship journey, steps of obedience in faith. And that's something else that we can do. We can look for ways to encourage each other and new believers on this journey of faith. For Philip, that meant encouraging the Ethiopian to be baptized, and he did that right away after his conversion. But then God took Philip to Caesarea. He took the Ethiopian further along the road and eventually back home to Ethiopia. Church history would say that for the Ethiopian, he went back and became a missionary and evangelist to the Ethiopians. We see Philip again later on in Acts. We'll come across him in Acts 21, where we hear that there is Philip, the evangelist, who is living in Caesarea. And God uses him there to continue to proclaim this message and this good news about Jesus. And so we can be ready to be used by God to share the good news. We can be filled with his Spirit. We can boldly and confidently share the good news about Jesus. And we can encourage steps of discipleship and obedience on our journey of faith with God. That's our summary of Acts chapter 8, 26 to 40.